Welcome, everybody. We're just waiting for everybody to join the meeting, and then we're going to start. So, hello, everybody. It's really wonderful to have so many of you with us. We're absolutely delighted to welcome you to this webinar, which is hosted by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and British Pugwash. It's an absolutely fantastic evening of discussion with Annie Jacobsen, the author of the international bestseller Nuclear War, a Scenario. So I'm Sophie Bolt, I'm the General Secretary of CND, and I'll be co-chairing along with Tim Street. So Annie's book is this, absolutely chilling minute by minute account of what follows a nuclear attack, really exposing the absolutely sort of horrific realities of such a war. And I think it's an absolutely critical intervention into a political debate that is increasingly normalizing the use of nuclear weapons in war, alongside this, the sort of nuclear weapon states are increasing and modernising their nuclear weapons. Certainly here in Britain, the government has put nuclear weapons at the heart of its Strategic Defence Review, published just 10 days ago. It argues that a modernised nuclear deterrent is the bedrock of the UK's defence and the cornerstone of its commitment to NATO and global security. Yet, as Annie's book so powerfully exposes, having a strategy at the core of your defense policy based on the annihilation of the entire planet doesn't keep us safe or the globe secure, but risks, our deaths every day. So, as I say, her book is an absolutely critical intervention into the global debate on nuclear disarmament, why it's so urgent and why we all need to get behind it. So just before I hand over to Annie, I just want to introduce Tim Street, as I say, from British Pugwash, so who's co-hosting for tonight. So over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Sophie. Good to be with you. So yeah, my name's Tim. I'm the Secretary of British Pugwash. So if you haven't heard of it before, Pugwash is an international network of scientists, experts, and members of the public concerned about the social impact of science and technology, particularly the threat posed by nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction. And Pugwash shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995 with its founder, Professor Joseph Rotblat, for working on arms control and disarmament during the Cold War. So if you'd like to stay in touch with our work, do consider becoming a member. So I'll put a link in the, well, maybe not in the chat, but there is an easy way of finding out how to join online. And we hold regular events and produce analysis and updates on nuclear weapons and other issues relating to peace and security. So like I say, do think about joining as a member? So as Sophie said, it's great to be co-hosting this webinar today, and very exciting to have Annie with us, whose book is a really important contribution to understanding the threat posed by nuclear weapons today. And we actually have a few copies of the book, one of which I have here, which I've read a couple of times now and has found it very gripping. So if you would like a free copy, do email me at office@britishpugwash.org with your name and address. That's office@britishpugwash.org, your name and address, and I'll see if I can get a copy to you. So that's me done. So yeah, over to you now, Annie, I think.
I'm just going to quickly do a quick quick intro on Annie, just in terms of giving you a bit of a background. So as as well as being the author of this of the Pulitzer Prize finalist, the Pentagon's Brain. She's now the author, obviously, of this current international bestseller, Nuclear War, a Scenario. But her other New York Times bestsellers include Area 51, Operation Paperclip, Surprise, Kill, and Vanish. And I feel that these, they're a real sort of expose of the real world, hidden from view in relation to the US sort of arms and nuclear industry. She also writes for television. She's a graduate of Princeton University. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband and her two children. Her books have been named Best of the Year, most anticipated by outlets including the Washington Post, USA Today, the Boston Globe, Newsweek, many more. And coverage, has ranged from the Wall Street Journal to the Economist. and audiences have included the Vatican and the United Nations. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us tonight, Annie, or this morning for you. Really looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, and it's really a privilege to be here. I'm going to take you through the scenario in my book quickly, and then we'll open it up for some questions and talk about some of the interesting issues that have been raised in those introductions and how they may impact all of us. So I am Annie Jacobsen, a journalist and author. And in reporting nuclear war, a scenario, I wanted to know a specific answer to a specific question. I wanted to know what happens if deterrence fails. And so I put this question to 46 former presidential advisors, secretaries of defense, commander of the nuclear subforces, Obama's longtime FEMA chief, um, all from an American point of view. And I asked retired General Robert Keeler, who is the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, and that makes him the steward of all U.S. nuclear weapons and all U.S. nuclear weapons systems. I asked General Keeler what would happen in a full-scale nuclear exchange with Russia. And he said to me, Annie, the world could end in the next couple of hours. And that was astonishing to me. And I think we owe him a debt of gratitude for his candor. That is not a common statement from someone who is a former STRATCOM commander, but it's an important one. Today, there are approximately 12,300 nuclear weapons on the planet. Between the US and Russia alone, there are more than 3,000 of them on what is called ready for launch status. I learned in my reporting there is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. We can talk about that at the end. But every declassified nuclear war game at the Pentagon shows this. And this is what all of my sources told me. And they told me that nuclear war unfolds in seconds and minutes, not in days and weeks, which is why I write this book with a ticking clock scenario. And I'm now going to take you through that very quickly. If North Korea were to launch a bolt out of the blue attack against Washington, D.C., it will take just 33 minutes for the nuclear weapon to travel on an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, from Pyongyang to Washington, D.C. An ICBM cannot be redirected and it cannot be recalled. President Obama's top nuclear advisor, Andrew Weber, told me a bolt out of the blue nuclear attack against Washington is what Washington fears most. Another person I interviewed for the book was Richard Garwin, the architect of the first hydrogen or thermonuclear bomb. When Edward Teller couldn't make it explode, Garwin did. He was just 23 years old at the time. And I asked Garwin what troubled him most. He died a couple weeks ago, but he was doing interviews all the way through his late 90s. And what Garwin told me was, he said, a nihilistic madman with a nuclear arsenal is what kept him up at night. And I took that to mean North Korea. So here's what happens from that Defense Department point of view with a bolt out of the blue attack against Washington. The United States has a system of satellites in space called SBIRS, and it takes less than 1 second for those satellites to detect the launch. The space-based systems calculate the trajectory, and they figure out in a matter of seconds that the ICBM is headed toward the continental United States. In the next 1 to 3 minutes, senior military officials characterize the threat from inside 3 nuclear bunkers inside the United States. And those are the Cheyenne Mountain complex in Colorado that's made famous in many Hollywood movies. That's known as the brainstem. There's the National Military Command Center, which is a bunker beneath the Pentagon. And that was referred to me as the beating heart of nuclear war. And then there's the Stratcom battle deck underneath Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. And that is called the muscle. 250 seconds have passed. That is 4 minutes and 10 seconds since this launch was detected from Pyongyang. And that is when confirmation occurs that it is not just coming to the continental United States, but that missile is coming to the east coast of the United States. The Missile Defense Agency here in the United States prepares its interceptor missiles to try and intercept this incoming ICBM. There is a fallacy that these things work. They do not. The US has 44 interceptor missiles. I told you a moment ago that there are 3,000 of them between US and Russia alone. You can just do the math. But even worse than that is the success rate. The success rate by the Missile Defense Agency's own calculations is less than 50%. So our $1 trillion tracking system, which is called the XBX radar system at sea, it fails to accurately track the missiles. And so these interceptor missiles miss. It has only been 9 minutes. In Alaska, ground radars give what is called secondary confirmation. That is required because the president is now about to launch a nuclear counterattack. This is policy. And many people are astonished by this fact, but the US has a policy called launch on warning, and it is precisely how it sounds. We launch on warning. The United States does not wait to absorb a nuclear blow. If a missile is coming, we launch. And so this presidential authority really is something new to many people, I think, who read the book, because you would think in a democracy that if the president is going to launch a nuclear attack, he would have to have permission from someone. He does not need permission from anyone, not the Secretary of Defense, not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and not Congress. This all has to do with that fact that that missile is coming and it is going to hit in approximately 30 minutes. People sometimes say, well, how do we know that for sure? Because the president at this point has a 6-minute window to deliver the counterattack orders. 6 minutes. I did a test in my own house, and that is about the same amount of time it takes to make a 10-pot cup of coffee with an automatic drip machine. And that is the amount of time that the president has to make a decision. One of the only presidents who has ever spoken about this, actually the only US president, was Ronald Reagan. And he wrote in his memoirs, 6 minutes to decide how to respond to a blip on a radar scope and decide whether to release Armageddon. How could anyone apply reason at a time like that? That's his quote, and that is terrifying. If a rogue nation were to launch a strategic ballistic missile at the US, the response would be overwhelming force. Another Stratcom commander, General Hyten, recently went on CNN and in an interview said that if Pyongyang were to launch a nuclear missile at the United States, they needed to know that we would launch one back. And then he said, if they launch 2, we'll launch 2. But in my reporting, I found that actually, if they launch 1, the United States will launch between 80 and 82 nuclear missiles in response. So the president gives the launch order. The B-2 bombers take off. The nuclear-armed ICBMs launch. The nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered submarines launch their missiles. I learned in my reporting that these are generally called the handmaidens of the apocalypse. And I was told by the commander of the nuclear forces Admiral Connor the reason why. And this is because they are so stealthy. No one can find these submarines. That goes for our submarines. It also goes for Russia's submarines, China's submarines, and probably the UK submarines. But what Admiral Connor said to me is, a nuclear-armed submarine is as dangerous an object to humanity as an incoming asteroid. That gives pause. The US has 14 of these subs. Each of them has 20 active missile tubes. Each missile tube carries a missile that has 4 warheads in each missile. Each warhead is 455 kilotons. I'm just giving you a little context here about how powerful these nuclear weapons are. The Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons. The Nagasaki bomb was 21 kilotons, according to the Defense Department. 455 kilotons is a half a megaton. It's extraordinary. It could, level a city. There are 4 of them in one missile on a sub. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently said, and this is before my book published, he said, humanity is just one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. Think about that. And here's where that happens in the scenario. Russia's command and control system mirrors that of the United States. There are technical flaws in theirs. I write about them. But the real existential threat I learned in my reporting, and it's something that was so shocking to me, I confirmed it with former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. And it goes like this. America's ICBMs in silos across the Midwest do not have enough range to target North Korea without overflying Russia. And so you can imagine in a moment of crisis like this, where the clock is ticking, where there are less than 30 minutes in entirety, where the president has 6 minutes to make this decision to do a counterattack, where there are now only minutes left before that weapon hits the United States. The president launches these ICBMs, doesn't have a chance to communicate with Russia. The former president hadn't communicated with the Russian counterpart the entire Ukraine war when he was in office. And so there would be every reason to Russia presume that America is actually launching a sneak attack against Russia. And that is that existential flaw where the full exchange of nuclear weapons between Russia and the United States that General Keeler warned us about happens in my scenario. When the nuclear winter theory was first written in 1983, because that is how I end the book, because that is how nuclear war ends. When that nuclear winter theory was first published, with Carl Sagan leading authoring that paper with his 4 colleagues, the Defense Department called it Soviet propaganda. But behind the veil, they knew it was true. And anyone who's not familiar with nuclear winter, the soot from thousands of fires burning in this full-scale nuclear exchange with those 3,000 nuclear weapons on ready for launch status launched. The fires that will burn, the 100, 200, 300 square mile fires burning out from the center of each ground zero. The soot lofts into the air to the tune of billions of pounds of soot. And this blocks out the sun's warming rays. This is nuclear winter theory. Agriculture will fail. Bodies of fresh water will become entombed in thick sheets of ice. People will freeze and starve. And the state-of-the-art climate modeling today, as opposed to that was done in 1983, demonstrates that nuclear winter will be far worse than was originally proposed. The mid-latitudes, the bread baskets of the world from Iowa to Ukraine, freeze over. And in this depraved, radiation-poisoned world, the humans that remain will likely return to their hunter-gatherer state. This was proposed by Carl Sagan and colleagues in 1983, and this is true today. And for this reason, in closing, it's why in my book, in the end, in the very epilogue, I include a photograph of a Neolithic hunter-gatherer site from 12,000 years ago. It's called Göbekli Tepe, and it's in southern Turkey. And it is the archaeological remains of a time when we were all still hunter-gatherers, when we hunted and fought with spears. And the reason I included this was to echo a quote by Einstein. At the dawn of the nuclear age, Albert Einstein was asked what he thought about nuclear war, to which he is said to have responded, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." Before archaeologists discovered Göbekli Tepe in the 1990s, for 12,000 years, no one knew it was there. How'd they find it? I interviewed one of the two archaeologists who was there that day when Göbekli Tepe was found, and he told me this, which is a tiny hopeful note in this very grim discussion. The archaeologist told me that a local rumor persisted in Turkey, and that the locals told him that the way in which they could find this mysterious site, which may or may not be there, was to locate something called the wishing tree, and it was high on a hill. And they said that this was a place of great power and mystery. This was an idea that had been passed down through time. And it was a place where people went to make wishes for the future. And sure enough, that is where the archaeologists found Göbekli Tepe. And in the book, I have a photograph of the wishing tree. You can see it before the site is uncovered. And, the reason that I include that is because wishing is really foundational, and it's very foundational to any organization that really leans into disarmament. Because the disarmament world, my disarmament colleagues, they're up against this military industrial complex behemoth that is a very powerful force. But I think that the story of Göbekli Tepe is a wonderful way to end on, because wishing is the solution. Wishing leads to action. I look forward to your questions and our discussion. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Annie. I mean, incredibly stark, but as I say, just so important to just go through the sort of the destructive power of nuclear weapons. But as you say, to end on this very positive, our faith in humanity, which will make sure that we won't end up with destroying the planet. Now I'm going to ask Tim. I think Tim's going to ask the first question, and then we're going to go to the Q&A. Thank you so much, everybody who's put your questions in already. We've got loads come in, but this is your amazing opportunity to ask Annie whatever you want. So yeah, so do put questions in, but I'm going to go to Tim first. Over to you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie, and thanks, Annie, for that introduction, which I also thought was good because it does address some of the points people have raised about your book, which covers so much in terms of nuclear weapons policy and the history and the development of the US nuclear arsenal, for example. The question I wanted to ask is probably something that's on people's minds, just to bring it up to date now, is you discuss in a lot of detail the decision-making process involved in the US use of nuclear weapons, how you think the process would unfold I'm just wondering if you think there would be much different with different president in charge, or a different presidential team or administration. Obviously, I'm alluding to Biden,
Yes.
Trump. So, given their mindsets, what do you see any difference between how a Democrat, Republican president would approach this, or a Trump would? Yeah,
Yes.
that's my question.
What a great question. And to that end, I'm going to speak to what people may be familiar with, the football. So there is a satchel that the President of the United States that follows him around 24/7, 365. In my reporting, I also learned there is one with the vice president as well. And inside that satchel, there's a military aide carrying it. And inside of it are what are called the Black Book. And that's the nickname. The reason it's called the Black Book, I was told by a Los Alamos engineer, is because it involves so much death. And so the counterattack are pre-programmed, meaning they're pre-designed. I interviewed for the book two different people who had worked on these, protocols, worked on the formulas to deliver this information to the president. It starts off with a volume of information covering each nuclear armed adversary of the United States and gets whittled down into what are called counterattack options. And so, to your question, like, how would the one president deal with this versus another? It's interesting for us all to realize that it's not a matter of saying, okay, Mr. President, what do you think we should do? Rather, it's which option would you like to go for? And the only leaked, if you will, information on this counterattack, on the Black Book, comes from one of the military aides who carried that football during the Clinton administration. He gave an interview on the subject with Smithsonian Magazine, and he likened the Black Book pages to those in a Denny's menu. Denny's is a fast food restaurant we have here in the United States. So as if you're looking at a laminated card that says, option A. Oh, I'm going to choose some of those weapons. And so to that end, it is how I formulated the 82 weapon counterattack against Pyongyang, that it would come from 50 ICBMs and 32 sub-launched ballistic missiles, because that was alluded to me that may be one of the options. But you can see that maybe the difference, the shade of gray, if you will, between presidential reactions would be the degree of weapons. But I don't know if you can get much more aggressive than 82 nuclear weapons launched against a target.
Okay. Right, thank you for that. I'm now going to go to some of the questions. I'm going to take, first of all, we've had one from Franco Escobar, who's an amazing student, is saying, thank you for a wonderful event. He's saying that you mentioned that there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. What are your thoughts on whether the Cold War itself was, in fact, a limited nuclear war, in the fact that there were, nuclear tests? And he's sort of saying, so do you feel the country's kind of inflicted sort of self-damage through all these detonations on the populations that they kind of deemed expendable? So I don't know, if you want to
No, it's a
come back on.
great
Yeah.
point to bring up. And I have learned from my new colleagues that work on the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, just how important this point that is being made in the question is, that the damage done to the individuals harmed completely unwittingly in these Cold War nuclear tests is profound. And I think their presence in these United Nations TPNW meetings is incredibly important, because it humanizes for all of us exactly what happens to the human body. You have individuals who are having multi-generational cancer effects from these tests. So most certainly, the Cold War testing exists in a lane of horror. But I do think it's important to differentiate that is not nuclear warfare, because we are talking about, when you're talking about nuclear warfare, you're talking about an actual strike, a use of a weapon in an environment that is a hot war. And I think that is the line in the sand that must never be crossed. And so I would hesitate to suggest that was war. Instead, it was something horrific, but I would not use the language of that was war.
Okay, I'm going to give you a couple more questions now, and then I'm going to hand over to Tim. So we've had two people sort of raising the point about like your book is kind of premised on the rogue state sort of being, you know, sort of North Korea. But what happens if that rogue state is the US, you know, and it's sort of using its first strike policy? You know, what's what you know, what do you think about that? What's the sort of scenario there?
I mean, it is a terrific question, and the fact that the United States has not gotten rid of, there's time and time again, leaders take office and say that they will get rid of two policies. One, launch on warning, which is profoundly dangerous, which I took you through in the scenario and I described. It's very, very dangerous. Almost every recent president has campaigned saying this is dangerous and I'm going to change it. Then they take office and they absolutely never say anything about it again. As far as first use, I mean, it is stunning to me that America has not adopted a no for first use policy, because it seems like that would be the moral high ground to take. But it has never happened because the Defense Department will always argue this kind of circular, insane logic of deterrence, that unless you have a strong posture that says, oh, we might strike you if you misbehave, deterrence can't hold. And so it's incredibly dangerous. And also, if you look back to the Bush era years, which was a follow-on program to the Clinton era years, there were programs on the books for what are known as the nuclear bunker buster programs, which were going to be able to first use of a nuclear weapon to strike a rogue facility that was determined to be making weapons of mass destruction, including biological weapons. And so, the questioner has brought up a very important point about this awful tangle of deterrence and posturing that I believe is madness. It is not mad. It is not mutual assured destruction. It is madness. And as I write in the acknowledgments of my book, every person I interviewed conveyed to me, either literally or figuratively, that nuclear war is insane. So we must get out of this loop of madness.
Thanks. Over to you, Tim.
Absolutely. I'm going to agree with you more. In the current context, obviously, the Russia-Ukraine war, which some see as a proxy war, which is really a war between the West and Russia via Ukraine, is uppermost in people's minds in terms of the risks of nuclear use. So we have a couple of questions. Firstly, from Johan, who asks what you think about the Ukraine's drone attack on Russian nuclear planes last week. And then Owen asks about the current state of Russia's nuclear fleet. Is it properly maintained? Do their weapons work as intended? You touched on some things to do with the satellite capabilities or the monitoring capabilities of Russia in the book, which is very interesting. Also, if I can ask another question, if you don't mind, Klaus asks about civil defense or public warnings about imminent attacks. So although taking cover could save hundreds of thousands from immediate death, the public aren't warned about it in the book. So is that official US policy?
So I'm actually going to start with the last question, the civil defense part of it. When I was reporting the book, as authors do, and this is also something I learned from television, writing the Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan series for Amazon, is that you need a good B story, because life has an A story and a B story. While this is happening, we also have other things happening. And so I imagined, as I went into this, that the scenario would involve a very strong B story involving civil defense, involving what I could imagine, even if the public wasn't protected. In America, I imagined the president being whisked off to a bunker, Raven Rock or Mount Weather. I imagined all of these officials that are responsible for continuing the government in the event of a catastrophe would be, and I was going to learn about that. And to learn about that, I called President Obama's long-serving FEMA chief. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency here in the United States. It helps out if there's a hurricane, a flood, an earthquake. And I asked Craig Fugate, so do you guys prepare for nuclear war? To which he bluntly said yes. And he said, we also prepare for asteroid strikes. These are called low probability, high consequence events. And then we talked a little bit about what is called population protection planning. Everything has an acronym here in the United States. And that has to do with how the government is going to help the population prepare for the catastrophe. But what Fugate said shocked me. He said, Annie, in the event, and I quote him directly in the book, he said, in the event of a nuclear war, a bolt out of the blue attack against Washington, there is no protection planning of the population because everyone will be dead. That is a direct quote from him. And even though the tape recorder was running, after we finished our interview, I had that reporter moment where I went, did he really say that? I checked it. He did. I called him back and said, did you mean to say this? And he said, yes, I did. And so there is no civil defense. And that is precisely the point. Now, Craig Fugate is a retired government official. And I have found in my reporting that individuals are a lot more candid when they leave office than when they are in office. The drone strikes, I mean, look, warfare is horrible. All war is horrible. What frightens me, literally, is the escalation of the conflict. And every time it escalates, some component of a weapon system with the word nuclear gets inserted into the dialogue. So Russia's drones targeted the nuclear delivery systems. Then Russia threatens by moving its nuclear delivery systems closer to the battlefront. And so the only solution I see in that is what I've learned from my colleagues working on the TPNW, on the treaty, which is another thing that treaty does, in addition to honor the victims and aim to compensate them of the Cold War testing, to humanize how horrible nuclear war would be and how horrible nuclear testing has been, is to make nuclear threats prohibited. And so that would be the best answer I can give about what I think about Ukraine, that the threats involved push us closer to the edge of peril.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Certainly for us, I think here, last year, sort of November time, it was really frightening. I think we really felt that we were kind of on the brink of nuclear war. So absolutely. So we've got a question here from James saying, how do you see the future of anti-missile defense, such as Donald Trump's, golden dome, as he calls it, this, sort of missile defense system. Yeah, what's your view on that? We were sort of talking about this earlier, some people are maybe seeing it as like a good way of sort of bringing about disarmament, or is it driving us towards sort of, a more sort of nuclear arms race end of things? So yeah, your view on Trump's golden dome.
And I had the same thinking as the person with that question, so thank you. Because my first thought, and I have heard the current president of the United States speak of what he calls denuclearization, which is a strange tongue-twisting word that essentially means disarmament. I think the current president of the United States likes to feel as if everything he comes up with is original, so we'll give him that term. But it is disarmament that he's talking about. And so I knew that from him going into office, and I was taken aback when just a few days after taking office, he signed this EO, an executive order, requesting bids from the defense contracting world on the Golden Dome. And the Golden Dome, metaphorically, poetically, is kind of the 2025 version of what Reagan was. And in my previous books, I interviewed many of the scientists who worked on those problems. And we know that that was a flawed system that could never work. And that's why it never went through. And so a lot of the thinking is this is a terrible idea, it's a bad system. But I have spoke to a number of technologists who and defense contractors, this is, who are working on those systems. And I have come to the conclusion that the technology available for the Golden Dome, which is cube satellite based, could possibly work, meaning it could possibly shoot down incoming missiles. I don't know, and I do not have a top secret clearance, and the people that I interviewed do, and there's a point at which they stop talking. Does that mean it's bluster? Does that mean it's psychological warfare? You know, does that mean it's fostering a greater sense of an arms race in space? People have to decide that for themselves. What I do know is I took the exact question to my colleagues at the United Nations who have written the treaties and said, is the dome, you know, like, does it cancel out the concept of disarmament? And they said no. And I found that to be inspiring, that the two lanes could be pursued at once, that you can pursue defense, you know, with all of its military industrial complex trappings nonetheless, but that that could be pursued, and denuclearization, disarmament in old school terms, could be pursued at the same time.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask a few questions. Thanks everyone for posting them. We're going to try and get through as many as possible, but there are quite a lot. So I'm going to bundle a few together. I'm going to start with coming back home to the UK. So Tom is asking a question, I think, about the fact that we've had obviously the Strategic Defence Review came out, and people have mentioned that it's very full-throated on the UK's nuclear weapons, getting behind that. And people are asking about what that will mean for society if the UK's pursuing a PR campaign or an education campaign in favour of nuclear deterrence and maintaining nuclear weapons, and your take on that. And what is your thoughts on Keir Starmer committing so strongly to Trident in terms of the UK's international legal obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to disarm? And connected to that, other people, Fiona and Joel, are asking about how we move to a more to reducing the threat posed by nuclear weapons in terms of arms control and disarmament. What role does the TPNW, the Nuclear Ban Treaty, have to play? And how can we de-risk nuclear politics? I know there's a lot there, but I'll probably frame it as, can you reflect on what's going on in the UK and thinking about nuclear disarmament politics? Thanks.
Yes, a couple interesting thoughts. I was surprised to learn in my reporting that the NATO 100 some odd nuclear weapons that are at the NATO bases are controlled by the United States and require US president authorization, with some suggestion from the UK as well. So that is classified, but that is interesting that those weapon systems are not, you know, in control of anyone other than the US president. So now we suddenly see these new initiatives to, and I think the questioner was correct in saying these are public facing developments. You know, this has reached the cultural zeitgeist where people are talking about this. And so what to make of all this, that the posture in Europe is moving toward this idea, and you certainly hear France saying that you know, nuclear weapons make us safe. Well, I think if you read my book, you clearly realize that that is a wives' tale. It's a Cold War myth. But, and this is the paradox of deterrence, nuclear weapons have kept us safe since 1949 when Russia first got the bomb. So what is really a solution? And I think I'm going to speak about that, which is that it's diplomacy. You can wave your stick or your spear or your ICBM, but the only ray of real forward movement I have found in all of my historical research on this subject comes from, interestingly, a Reagan era moment. And I'll tell that story quickly because it's slightly positive and it's not slightly positive, it's very positive, and it speaks to communication. More weapons are more weapons. This is madness, as I put forth. But if we consider that Ronald Reagan was a nuclear hawk, he took office under the premise that more nuclear weapons made America more safe. This is what you're seeing now in Europe. And he put forth the strategic defense, the Star Wars program. But then one night, Ronald Reagan watched a television movie called The Day After. And his chief of staff even said, don't watch it, but he watched it anyways. And 100 million Americans also watched it. It showed a fictional scenario of a nuclear war, a full-scale nuclear war between the United States and Russia. And I think you have a similarly styled one called Threads. But The Day After made our former president depressed. He wrote that in his White House journal. And as a result, to the chagrin of his national security advisor, he reached out to Gorbachev because he realized that the only way forward, the only real true pathway to peace, to reducing the nuclear threat, was communication. And in reaching out to Gorbachev, I'm reminding you, this was the Cold War. Russia was the twirling mustache bad guy in America. And yet Reagan knew he needed to transform this idea of Russia, of the Soviet Union, from the enemy, in military terms, you kill the enemy, to the adversary. In diplomatic terms, you work with your adversaries. And that is why the world has gone from the all-time high in 1986 of 70,000 nuclear warheads, 70,000, to the approximately 12,300 we have today, because of the communication between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. And that is where I absolutely believe we must move. And my final thought on that is that as I have been told by my colleagues at the TPNW, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It did not happen in a vacuum. People were marching in Central Park. They were marching in Hyde Park. The public would not stand for 70,000 nuclear weapons like the sword of Damascus over their head. They wouldn't stand for it. And so it's a combination of the people and the president or the prime minister.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, some more questions for you. So we've got one from Martin who's saying that he sort of shied away from the anti-nuclear campaigning because it was just so awful. You know what I mean? It's just, I can't cope with this. And we sort of regrets that now. And is saying, how can we use your fantastic research in a way that doesn't, scare people into sort of inaction or, feeling that you can't do anything about it. So that's the first question, which I'm sure you'll definitely be able to answer. Then we've got another one from Professor Paul Rogers, who's sort of wanting you to sort of elaborate in relation to low yield nuclear weapons that are really being pushed as weapons that can be sort of used in war. So can you talk about that in terms of them being used as a sort of a demonstration of sort of intent? So that's in relation to lowering the kind of the sort of the sort of barrier in terms of what you define as sort of a nuclear war. Then we've got another question which is really interesting from dear Linda, who's saying, war heroes are often very much sort of celebrated, in terms of being involved in the Paralympics and that sort of thing, but you never see any hibaksha, never any sort of victims of, atomic bombing. So do you feel, that there's this sort of a silencing and attempt to sort of cover up, the realities of sort of nuclear war? And then the final question is, we've had quite a lot of questions around, the potential of nuclear war through near misses and mistakes. I mean, you talk about this quite a lot in your book, but if you can talk more about that and how you feel, you know, that being a real sort of potential that ends the planet.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to start with the great questions, all of them, and I'm going to start with the hibakusha question. I write about Satsuko Thurlow in my book, in the very small part of it where I say how we got here. Before the nuclear launch to nuclear winter that happens in 72 minutes, I give you a brief overview. And I tell Satsuko's story because it's so powerful. She's now 93, and she was a young girl. It's essentially ground zero Hiroshima. But the hibakusha won the Nobel Peace Prize this year. And I think that, and I and myself am going to Hiroshima in August to participate in a conference to honor the 80th, commemorate the 80th anniversary. And so it's a great question. It's a great point, and everyone can do what they can to get to tell those stories and continue to tell them. And Satsuko is but one person who has been brave enough to tell her story over and over again so that people can carry that message because it is a powerful one. As far as, tactical weapons, and that is a very common question, I'm going to refer to something in the book that there's one known declassified nuclear war game called Proud Prophet. And I reprint a page of it in the book. And if I could hold it up, you would see it's entirely redacted, meaning it's all blacked out. The only word you see is scenario, and then a page number. And so people may say, well, why on earth would you print that? And why would that even, how does that even benefit anyone if that's what a declassified war game looks like? But here's why it benefits us, because it allows people who participated in that war game, and the Pentagon runs hundreds of these a year, I have learned. Proud Prophet was a very long one. It lasted for 2 weeks. But it allowed, by declassifying it, it allowed individuals who participated in that to speak in a general way, not specifically, but in a general way without violating their security clearance. And this speaks to the tactical weapons because one of the people who was involved in that back in the 80s is now a Yale professor named Paul Bracken. And he tells us in his words about that experience. And there's a point at which he's talking about tactical nuclear weapons. And he says this, he says, what we learned from the Proud Prophet nuclear war game was that no matter how nuclear war begins, if NATO is involved, if NATO's not involved, if China's involved, if China's not involved, if tactical nuclear weapons are involved, if they're not involved, no matter how it begins, it ends only one way: total nuclear annihilation. And that is why the talk of a tactical nuclear weapon is pure madness, in my understanding. The fellow who asked about afraid of the anti-nukes, what an earnest question. And I think all of us go through that. Some people love belonging to groups and others shy away from being, pigeonholed perhaps as part of a group. But I think what's important is you find your own way, you find your own lane. And you can have autonomy within that. You don't have to become a flag bearer in the front row, so to speak. But you can have a voice. And that is what I think is so important about the groundswell of activity I see right now in the disarmament campaign. And again, the threats are ratcheting up, but so is the interest to counter that. Finally, there was a question about, I can't see my own writing, so I'm sorry, I can't answer the
Fine.
question.
It was about, the possibility of nuclear war through mistakes, mistakes and,
Yes, yes,
all of that, and like tech going wrong and all of that.
yes. Yes, so as a reporter, I like to tell first-hand witness stories. Sometimes things go through the telephone game and facts change, but I learned a stunning first-hand witness story from former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. And this was when he was not yet SecDef, but he was on the night watch with President Carter being in office. So it was his position to, in the event of a nuclear alarm, tell the president. And he got that call from the bunker beneath the Pentagon saying there are hundreds of nuclear armed ICBMs on the way and hundreds of sub-launched ballistic missiles. So this looked absolutely like a full-scale nuclear attack. And this message was also coming from the command bunker at Stratcom in Nebraska. And Bill Perry told me this story a few years ago, and I got the sense from him as he was telling it to me. I could feel in his voice the sort of reliving of that fear, because he believed that he was going to have to tell President Carter, now you must choose a counterattack, a nuclear counterattack against Russia. And instead, the phone rang again. And it was the bunker beneath the Pentagon. And they had made a mistake. And the mistake was this. This was back in the days of VHS tapes. Someone had put a training tape into the VHS machine at the Pentagon and by accident hit play. It was also appearing in the Stratcom bunker because they were connected. Of course they were. And what Perry said to me was it looked real because it was designed to look real. And that is but one of about a dozen declassified stories of near misses. There's a series in the Washington Post yesterday which talks about some new ones. So I think we can all imagine, if that's what's been declassified, imagine the number of near misses we have had that really takes the breath away.
Yeah, and we don't even know those involving Russia because they're not in the public domain. Sophie, shall I do one more round of questions and then you do one more if Annie will indulge us? Does that sound okay? So yeah, again, and if people have questions like maybe that are more factual, you're welcome to email myself or Sophie and CND and Pugwash and ask them to us and we'll try and help you out. The first one I have is from Hugh, who talks about limited nuclear war in the context of India and Pakistan. And his question is, he's trying to find arguments about, he understands on an instinctual level that limited nuclear war couldn't be contained, but he's wondering if you have any other thoughts on why that might be so to help him out there. Then secondly, Gunnar asks about whether there is a, because you talked today a lot about the importance of communication, and in the book you talk about the lack of communication between different leaders. And he was wondering, is there a DPRK US hotline? Thirdly, someone asks about where the public is in America about US about nuclear weapons. What are their views at the moment in terms of polling, for example? And then finally, a really interesting question, which I like, from Taylor, and it resonates with what you were saying at the end of your talk about Göbekli Tepe. And he's talking about, are you insinuating that humanity has done this type of thing before, like we have a kind of inbuilt instinct for self-destruction? He says, do we get to an inevitable point of having to start over again as hunter-gatherers? And that reminds me, I was reading your book in detail today, and you start off with a quote from Winston Churchill, who says, "The story of the human race is war." So I thought that might be a slightly different angle to look at. Thanks.
Fantastic questions, all of them. I'm going to start with the Pakistan-India question. The nuclear winter theory was written by 5 authors, one of whom is Brian Toon. He was Carl Sagan's student in the 80s. He's an elder professor now. You know, he's still with us. And he has been on this issue for all the decades since. And he has a brilliant paper with colleagues that demonstrates what would happen in terms of nuclear winter after an exchange between Pakistan and India. I don't write about this in the book, but I know this from Toon, and I cite the paper in my footnotes if you want to locate it. And the reason it's important is this, is that many analysts believe that the most likely, or one of the most likely scenarios where nuclear war could happen, is between Pakistan and India. And we just saw how those tensions occurred recently. And Toon and his colleagues map out with state-of-the-art climate modeling systems what would happen. India and Pakistan are understood to each have about 170 nuclear weapons. So that's a small full-scale exchange if you consider the 3,000 that US and Russia have, not including the other several thousands that they have in their arsenals that take a few hours to come out. And Toon and his colleagues demonstrate how essentially a mini nuclear winter would happen from the soot lofted into the air from that 300 weapon exchange. And so, given how big the cities are that would burn. And so that is something to read and contemplate. The communication part of it and the DPRK hotline is interesting, and I'm gonna share something here that's not in my book and that is somewhat new, and it is fascinating to me. And also because, Sophie, you mentioned last November and that really perilous time I think you're referring to, when America authorized the ATACMS and UK authorized the Sea Shadows. Those were happening in Ukraine, and then Russia launched what was initially reported as an intercontinental ballistic missile into Ukraine. It turned out to be a intermediate range ballistic missile. I was in London at the time, and I remember getting on the plane, when I had just heard that and going, this is like crazy. And a week later, I found myself in Washington, D.C., and the Assistant Secretary of State, so that's the number 2 at the State Department, and the person in charge of disarmament, said to me, "Annie, let me show you the NERC." We were having a discussion about how dangerous this was. And if anyone remembers of that perilous time, because we all thought, I was thinking to myself, how did a counterattack not happen with this launch on warning policy? Biden was still president. You know, you kind of get the idea. I'm stumbling a little bit here, but Lavrov went on television and said, "We conveyed an electronic message to our American partners." That is what he said. And I, with a decent amount of knowledge on this subject, did not know what he was talking about. I did not know what this meant, an electronic message. But the Assistant Secretary of State explained to me what it was, because she took me into the State Department, into a sort of quasi-secret facility. And I say secret because it's not well known, but it's not classified. It's why I was able to go in there, called the NERC, the National Nuclear Reduction Facility. And that is where, and as I stood in the NERC, I heard ping, ping. Every 90 seconds, I heard an electronic signal. And what Mallory Stewart explained to me was that this is what Lavrov was referring to. They sent a message, that electronic ping, saying, "We are launching an intermediate range ballistic missile into Ukraine, and it does not contain a nuclear warhead." If that isn't confounding, confusing, frightening, but also like the tiniest moment of, well, at least ... But it underscores the perilous nature and the absurdity of all of this. That is what we are relying on to not have nuclear Armageddon.
Yeah.
Oh, now I'll answer the final question about Göbekli Tepe, because, I enjoy reading people's theories that, once upon a, before the Ice Age, we were an advanced culture. I just find all that fascinating for my own imagination. Separate from that, just on a factual scientific level, I think what I was really interested in was realizing that, because the Göbekli Tepe archaeological site is so vast, and we now know from the further sites being investigated there, it's just giant and involved thousands and thousands of people with complex thinking to create architecture. to create a place where they could all gather. So this was a civilization, and yet none of us even knew it was there. And I think my point was also to try and raise a component of sort of national, or rather global, hubris, which is that we just think we're so important and we're going to be here forever and we could never end. And that is what I ask people to question, which is how bizarre that technology that has brought us to be able to do this Zoomed here today. I'm in Los Angeles. That same kind of human thinking, the brilliance of the engineer, the problem solver, also has created a set of problems that could end it all in 72 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. I mean, we could, we could ask you loads more questions. So I'm sorry we can't ask all of them, but I thought it'd be useful to sort of finish on the more kind of positive questions that we've had. So, in terms of like, how can we get, how can we shift things? So, Joel's kind of asking like, what's going to sort of move the needle? What are the sort of necessary conditions for, as he calls it, global nuclear de-risking? He's saying it's clearly not just, you can elect one good person in one country, it's got to be kind of more than that. Then we've had sort of Fiona saying, what's your views around how powerful or influential can the TPNW be when you have this very failure to engage with the TPNW from the nuclear weapons states. And then the sort of the final question is sort of, we've had a question around like what is a role that the Security Council members could be playing in terms of really starting to sort of kickstart nuclear disarmament and sort of the arms control treaties, that sort of thing.
I mean, this is the question. This is the heart of the matter. And I'm really, first of all, I'm very optimistic, or rather, when I was at the Vatican talking to the cardinals about this, they said, no, Annie, you're not optimistic, you're hopeful, which is another great word. So hopeful. Because I believe that things happen in small steps. At least when it comes to the population, which I am part of, and not a civil servant. Meaning that, all of us have many different things going on in our lives. We have A stories, B stories, C stories, and D stories. But when our attention gets pulled back to this important issue, I believe progress gets made. Here in America, the past several presidential elections, there have been zero mention of nuclear weapons. Our former President Biden said nothing of nuclear weapons his whole administration. And so the fact that when people are silent about an issue, I find it's the most dangerous, because the danger exists and it is only getting worse. And so, to the point about the TPNW, yes, the nuclear armed nations don't want to join because they want to hang on to their own nuclear weapons and they don't want to be pressured. But perhaps that works against them. Meaning, as people become literate about these kind of disarmament programs in bits and pieces, as the taboo moves away from, or rather the sort of ostrich in the sand with the neck exposed approach vanishes because we are in this time of peril, I think that people become more open to having discussions about them. The conversation has moved from the lofty know-it-alls, if you will, to just the regular people. When I was at the United Nations and I met these treaty writers, they said to me, and these were the subject matter experts of the subject matter experts. And they said to me, Annie, great job on the book. We forgot how simple it needs to be. And so that's where you realize we all have a say, and you just have a conversation with somebody about this without lecturing them, just a conversation.
Brilliant. Okay, well, we have actually got a little bit more time, so I'm wondering if we can sneak in a couple more questions, because it's sort of 22, and we know that you have to be gone by 5 too. So I'm just wondering if we can, yeah, sneak in a couple more questions.
Yes.
So one's a bit of a more light-hearted. So is your book going to be made into a film, Annie? Sorry, I mean that would be pretty frightening, wouldn't it? So yes, we've got that. We've also got some more kind of questions, I suppose, in relation to maybe kind of more technical ones. I'm not sure if they're probably right to take at this stage, but yeah, sorry, let me quickly have a look through. Oh yes, another one I thought was it'd be really good to get your view is like, is there a hotline between
Mm,
North Korea and the US? And can you talk a bit more about, that,
yes.
in terms of the real kind of comms that there is and how that can avert a nuclear war, and
Mhm.
where things are at, not just in terms of North Korea, but sort of other countries too.
Yes, and I'm glad that hotline question came up again because it's very important. And I meant to touch upon that in the NERC because that was the really the point of that, but I lost the thread there, which is that the NERC that I went to and visited in the State Department was set up specifically for as a hotline for Russia and the United States to kind of, you know, to take a hot situation down, to take the temperature down in the event of threats. And one example that I saw there, which best sums this up, because it's a little hard to conceptualize what they're actually doing in the NERC by this electronic message beep that just goes back and says, essentially, we're here. But they showed me, and it's on the wall, a message that was sent to Russia in the moments after 9/11, after the terrorist attacks in 2001 here, when the president raised the DEFCON level to 2, which is higher than it had been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We in the NERC, the United States, sent a message to Russia. Usually it's just an electronic beep, but occasionally it's a worded message. And it said, I'm paraphrasing, we have raised the DEFCON level. This is not directed at you, which is fascinating. Okay. So my question, like the listener's question here was, well, what about China? What about North Korea? And unfortunately, these are China is from my understanding from State Department officials, China has suggested it wants to be part of the NERC. And in some level it is, but we don't have regular electronic pinging sounds with them. North Korea, not at all. And this is very, very dangerous. And this is why, in this scenario, I chose a bolt out of the blue attack again from North Korea. It's what Richard Garwin was afraid of. And it has to do with the fact that even though there are no rules to nuclear war once it begins, God forbid, but there are rules to keeping nuclear war from happening, one of which, arguably the most important, is notifying your neighbors if you are going to test launch an ICBM. As I took you through the seconds and minutes that the Defense Department is scrambling after a ICBM launch to see the trajectory. If you consider North Korea launching these ICBMs as it does regularly into the sea, this is incredibly dangerous because imagine now the information that I've given you. You can imagine the Defense Department tracking that. All it takes is one miscalculation or one errant trajectory of that missile to really have a really big problem. And so, absolutely, North Korea should join the NERC.
Okay.
Oh, now I'm going to speak to the question about the film. Thank you.
Yep.
So, the my favorite filmmaker and one of the most profound filmmakers in the world, Denis Villeneuve, who directs the Dune films and Arrival and many of these incredible films. Um, I met with him before the book was published, and it's his mission to bring this movie this book to the big screen. And I cannot wait for him to do that. Movies are very, very powerful in the cultural zeitgeist. I spoke earlier of the ABC TV movie that moved Ronald Reagan toward diplomacy. I really look forward to this. Oppenheimer was a profound movie. So many of us saw it, but it also had a really interesting impact indirectly on me, which is why I'm such a fan of films and that kind of cultural opening up. It makes a kind of an awareness and has a discussion, which is, of course, the groundwork to diplomacy. But an interesting thing happened when I was researching the book. Nuclear weapons have come up in every one of my books. And so I've been to Los Alamos, to the archive, numerous times. And in my previous reporting, I always have gotten a kind of like real, line in the sand from the archivist and me as I asked for documents to be declassified. And this time, there was an exception, a serious exception. The archivist actually sort of leaned toward me. One of the archivists went so far as to declassify the origin story of the nuclear football, specifically for this book, which you can read about in the book. And I said to them, "What's the change of heart?" And they said, "Oppenheimer, the film, not the man." They said that they had been so overwhelmed in a positive way by the amount of mail they had received from people around the world interested in how this unfolded, that it changed their own perspective and attitude toward transparency. And if you're a journalist and an author like me, that is really important. And it's a metaphor for everything that we're talking about that could be hopeful.
Yes, most definitely. Well, I mean, Annie, thank you so, so much. It's just been absolutely fascinating and really amazing to hear you and meet you and and talk to you. Tim and I are both like, very, very pleased to have hosted this. I mean, I think just, final words from you, Tim. Final words from me. Any final words from you?
Yeah, just huge thanks. I mean, the questions today have been great. It's been a really good collective endeavor today. Um, Please do stay in touch with British Pugwash and CND's work, everyone. Um, and yeah, we do fairly regular events, so check out our YouTube channel. We will be uploading the video of this to our YouTube channels. If there's any further questions, do get in touch. People have begun emailing. And again, huge thanks to Annie for your great storytelling, your insights, the detail, yeah, and the range of and the breadth of analysis. So yeah, a great webinar. Thank you.
Mm. Yeah. And final from me is, I mean, knowledge and information is power, isn't it? And I think your book is so important from that point of view. I think for me, it was a bit like, the whole idea that nuclear weapons keep us safe and all that sort of stuff. Well, why is it like, the US been sort of like planning for decades, for sort of a nuclear attack on it? It's just so clear. My second point is, it's people and it's our protest movements that have stopped nuclear weapons from being used, so we must remember that we do hold the power here and we can really make things happen. So that, do get involved in any way that you can. As Martin said, it took him a while to get involved, but definitely do get involved. Very important at any level. And also a final plug for Annie's paperback, which comes out in Britain, in July, so you can get the paperback as well. So thanks very much again, and yeah, and look forward to seeing you all on a demonstration soon. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Annie.